Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're pleased to feature another webinar series from one of our customers here. And today we have Dr. Derek Moyer from Lehigh Valley Health Network that will be presenting on their experience, kind of the clinical implementation and commissioning of the Adaptiiv 3D printing software solution. Also joining us is Ellis Mitro. He's a medical physicist here at Adaptiiv. Ellis brings over 10 years of clinical experience to our company. He is registered with the Canadian College of Physicists and Medicine, CCPM, and was most recently the Chief of Medical Physics at Trois-Rivières Hospital in Quebec, Canada, here in our country, beautiful country. So thanks, Ellis, for joining us as well. Ellis will kind of help, at the end with a Q&A and kind of ask Derek a few questions if there aren't many that come in from the audience, but I encourage everyone to ask questions throughout in the chat feature, and we'll try to get to all of them at the end. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Adaptiiv and just kind of moderating this session. So I'm just going to say a little bit about Derek and then hand the mic over to him and let him take it away. Derek holds an undergraduate physics degree from Bucknell University and a Doctor of Medical Physics from the University of Cincinnati. He has graduate research performed in 3D printing and computer programming, and is currently an ABR certified clinical medical physicist specializing in SBRT, 3D printing, and scripting at Lehigh Valley Health Network. So Derek, why don't you take us through your presentation here and the steps you took in implementing Adaptiiv software.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. So yeah, we got into 3D printing in the clinic a couple of years ago. And today I'm going to be going over mostly our clinical implementation and a couple of cases that we've done here at Lehigh Valley. So as far as commissioning goes, there's two big projects to work on. One is the 3D printer itself, and the other is the software that you get with Adaptiiv. So the bottom left is the 3D printer that we chose. We did go through Adaptiiv to get it. It's Airwolf Axiom 20. It's a very large printer, so it helps with getting maybe chest wall boluses or things that are large and wouldn't fit on a traditional printer. And then on the right, you can kind of see it in action. We made a 3D bolus for a rando phantom, but high quality prints, and we definitely like it. And then after the commissioning process, I'm going to kind of go through the QA workflow and two cases. So one of the first things that we did with the 3D printer commissioning, so we got our 3D printer first, so that's kind of where we took off. So one of the most important things with the printer is making sure the prints that it does make are accurate in their dimensions and their resolution is good. So there's a test print that Adaptiiv will give you. It's in the bottom left. You basically just print it with your printer and you measure some of the dimensions. So some of the labels L1, 2 through 5 or 6. And then you can also place it on top of I call it like a fit test almost. You pretty much place it on top of the images above the yellow portion there and make sure that it's within the lines. So ours came out very good. There was no issues with this portion. In the center, we kind of have a depiction of how you can test the uniformity inside the print, and you can also get a mean CT number for that test print. So the Hounsfield units do vary a little bit, but they're well within the tolerance of 100 Hounsfield units. And then you can also get your mean CT number. And then one of the last things that you kind of look for is, you kind of make some prints on some other structures. So again, I think this is the rando bolus we made, but you want to make sure there's no holes with the visual inspection of the CT and just verify that spatially is okay and it's uniform again. So one of the biggest projects for a physicist in the 3D printer commissioning for me was figuring out what to tell our treatment planning system as far as the density of the printer and the material from it. So we did several tests to determine this. because, the 3D bolus is a material that's not, if you're doing the PLA, it's not typically used in radiation oncology. So we really wanted to put it through the ringer. And one of the first things that you can do is get a density from a mass of a print and the volume. So there are some softwares out there that can tell you the volume of your 3D print, and you can weigh the mass with any scale that, kind of goes down to grams. So on the bottom, we kind of see something that looks like an Excel file down there. And we have 3 of our prints, and we found the volume and measured the mass, and we got a density of about 1.2. So, 3 different prints, you can see that's fairly consistent. And we've had good results, even after the initial commissioning with values around there. We also did some beam measurements on we did 3D printed slabs, so pretty much just a rectangle with varying depths, so 3 millimeters to a whole centimeter. We measured it with map check and a chamber. So on the top right, you kind of see what we did with map check. So we overrode the density of the bolus in our treatment planning system to what we expected it to be, and then we delivered some beam on it. We did some electron and photon measurements. What you see up there is a measurement with a slab phantom with kind of a little bump in the center, because we wanted to test a little bit of the modulation, and it was very good. I think it was 100% at 2%, 2 millimeters. So very good results there. And then the bottom right, we did some relative measurements with electrons. So we measured in the treatment planning system the relative dose at a certain point from a uniform slab, and then the slab I made with the bump in the center. And then we measured it with the chamber, and the ratios are very good, less than 2%. So we got very comfortable with this number that we came up with. And then, kind of a peace of mind thing, which is what I call the hypotheticals. It's nice to figure out what would happen if, you forgot to change the density in the treatment planning system, or maybe you had one that was too high or whatever it may be. And the image of there's a patient with a bolus on top, and there's some isodose lines, and it's hard to tell, but there are actually different isodose lines from varying densities inside the treatment planning system. And the fact that they're very consistent and it's hard to tell a difference is very comforting. So we know that we're getting a dose and it's not going to vary too much. Say you had a density of a print that was 1.18 instead of 1.2, it's not going to affect the dose in a large way. So the software commissioning portion was led mostly by Adaptiiv. So there are some very nice, videos online. There's a lot of documentation and some case studies and even publishings from various topics for your software and your 3D printer. So that was the first step, just learning about that online. We also had a CAT meeting with Adaptiiv. So we chose to go with a standalone laptop for our 3D bolus software. And then, we kind of went over some of the MAC address things. We verified that the software was downloaded correctly. They have some test files that you pretty much put through the 3D bolus software and verify that it's done what it's supposed to do. It was a very easy, quick process. Then, once that was verified, we kind of had a virtual software training with all of our staff that would be covering the 3D printing process. Was very helpful for them. This is a new process for a lot of people, and this was kind of their first exposure to the whole process. So it was very helpful. One thing that you'll have to do is either set up a DICOM exchange or an import-export filters in your treatment planning system to make sure that you can transfer information from your planning system to 3D bolus and back. So that was a pretty easy process as well. We don't really see any issues there. And the final thing that we did was end-to-end testing. So this is kind of a test of your 3D printer and your software and everything in between. So it's nice to be able to do this on a phantom such as Rando, or I'm sure there's some other things that you could test it on. But you pretty much start the process like it's a patient, go through, plan, print, do your QA, and verify it. And everything turned out great. So for each patient, we have a quality assurance portion at the end of it. The first thing that we do with our printer, we have an FDM printer. So sometimes if there are supports, like the image of the rando bolus, which we've seen a couple times here, there's supports and they need to be taken off. And sometimes they can leave jagged edges. So you want to sand those down, make sure, like run your hands over them, make sure there's no sharp edges, which could potentially poke the patient or anything. You want to do that kind of on the inside too, on the face that is touching the patient's surface. We also just do a quick visual inspection, kind of just to make sure that the size is right. There's no holes, there's no printing issues. You didn't run out of filament in between or something along those lines. We do our density check. So the typical way we've done this is by using the STL volume, and we measure the mass on a scale. And that's where we got our 1.2 from initially. And we have had very consistent results, even year after. So the last thing that we do for a patient is we try and get them in on the CT scanner. We put the bolus on them and we do a short CT scan. So this verifies that the bolus fits the patient, and it also verifies the bolus is uniform. There's no holes. The scaling of the bolus is correct. And it's a good process. Yeah, so our patients are primarily identified by the physician in consult. So they'll have a patient that seems to have a skin lesion on their face or nose or, scalp. We've also done extremities, some irregular chest walls you can really do. And, there's a lot of things we've been, as we got used to this technology, there's all kinds of applications for the 3D bolus. So after the patient's identified, we kind of, put a flag on their sim and say somebody should be there who has experience with 3D bolus. It's just mostly because sometimes there's some unique things that you have to think about, like how the bolus is going to fit, if there's going to be anything in the way of where you want to put the bolus. So for instance, like if we know a patient's going to have a 3D bolus on their nose, we'll try and sim them with an open face mask, things like that. Once the patient is simmed, we then send it over to the planning portion of the workflow. We typically have a dosimetrist or sometimes a physicist plan. This is a process where the bolus is made in the treatment planning system. It is then, once you have a good plan and like the bolus, you then send it to the 3D bolus software. You make any edits you need to, and you send it back to the treatment planning system. And if all is well, the physician can approve that. Once it is approved, that's when we get into the actual printing and the QA workflow that we have. So we do the initial printing, sanding, weighing the mass. And once it's done, the patient comes back and goes to the CT. This is one thing with this. We started doing it maybe a day or two before the patient's treatment, just because it was new to us. We weren't exactly sure, if everyone was going to fit. But as we got more comfortable with it, we actually do this right before the patient is scheduled to be treated. And the important thing about this is you test the fit, the uniformity, there's no holes, but it's also a great time to change any immobilization you might need to do, or take pictures of how the bolus should be sitting on the patient. If there's any parts of the mask that need to be cut out, those kind of things. It's hard to get a lot of time on your machine for these kind of things, so it can be helpful to do it that way. And then once we verify that everything is well with the bolus, we send them for treatment. And we've had a lot of positive reviews, and we've gotten to the point where we actually get requests from the therapist to use 3D bolus. So they've definitely found it as a useful tool. So now we're going to go over a couple cases that stood out. This was a patient with two sites, one on the nose and one on the cheek. So there are actually two different types of cancer, which was very interesting. But we ended up making a modulated bolus and a uniform bolus. So if you look on the top right, there are two CTVs, one in red on the nose and one in red on the cheek. And this figure compares, on the left is our 3D bolus plan and what we could accomplish. And on the right is something that we'd probably try and do traditionally. As you can see, there is a lot of high dose spill around the sides of the nose. There is extremely hot dose in between the two sites. And we were able, with the modulated portion on the nose, to really conform that dose to the CTV on the nose, but also prevent the overlap between the two sites, which is a very big benefit. So we not only improved the coverage, we also reduced the hotspot for the plan. On the bottom left, you can kind of see our bolus. Ours is blue. It's from 3D fuel we get from Adaptiiv. It's a very high quality bolus, very high quality 3D printer for, other things such as phantoms that you might want to make. And to the right of that, it shows what it looks like in the treatment planning system when it's planned. We have an anchor point on the nose. We really like to use those because it gives a therapist a place to kind of make sure that the bolus is in the right position. So by using the nose, it's very hard to position it in the wrong place. And then on the right, we have cone beam CTs of this patient during treatment. As you can see with the nose portion, there's kind of a purple outline. The actual bolus fits very well to that purple outline, and that's what we planned it to look like. So it fits incredibly well. There's no real gaps there. We were very impressed by this. And then on the right, we have the cheek bolus, which is, same kind of story. There's almost nothing in between there. Covers exactly what we want. And if it is, not accomplishable with superflab or some other things, and you don't have the uncertainty of a wet gauze where you're not exactly sure what the density is because you don't know how long, it's been sitting there drying up or whatever. So it gives, a lot of certainty that the dose that you plan is the dose that you're getting, which is really nice. And then this was another interesting case. There was a sarcoma on the patient's heel of his foot, kind of went into the foot a little bit. But this patient had two previous treatments with electrons, and it wasn't really responding like we wanted it to. So we decided to give the bolus a chance, even though it was a photon treatment. And as you can see in the top right, we designed a bolus, which I think was 1 centimeter thick, to ensure that we got this dose on the surface. It kind of fits around his foot almost like a sandal, maybe you could equate it to, but it fit very well. And from the right picture, you can see that we didn't even have to use anything else to keep it in position. It just fit right on the patient, and he was ready for treatment. On the bottom there, on the bottom right, we have a picture of the plan. We were able to accomplish full dose throughout our target, which is very good. And, because the bolus fit so well, we were confident that that was getting accomplished at treatment as well. DVH shows that we have full coverage on the prescription dose. And the best thing about this treatment is the patient's outcome. So he was coming in, either in a wheelchair or, basically couldn't put a lot of weight on his feet, especially this one because, of the tumor and it being uncomfortable, and reduced his mobility. But after treatment, we've just heard some of the consults he's had afterwards have revealed that he's not using like walkers anymore. He's walking right in. The tumor's reduced in size. So this one was, it really stood out with the patient's outcome. So it was a really good application.
Thank you so much, Derek. That was a great overview of the implementation process and commissioning of our software with your workflow and using Adaptiiv for treatment at Lehigh Valley. So now we'll get into some questions that have come in from the audience. And again, please ask questions. If we don't get to them today, we'll follow up in an email with written answer in response to your question. So first one is, did you have to fine tune the slicing program parameters or did the settings provided by Adaptiiv suffice? So I guess the slicing program would be through the Axiom printer that you mentioned. So yeah, did you have to fine tune those or did the settings provided by Adaptiiv suffice?
So we had to do some fine tuning on the printer. Our zeroing of the bed level, we had to edit a little bit on the Axiom side, but we didn't actually change anything inside of the print files from Adaptiiv. So we pretty much went with it. We found that we liked the results, so we haven't had to even really look at that.
Great.
So we have a question here asking if you're doing any regular quality assurance on the 3D printer itself.
Yeah, so we typically don't have to do redo any of the commissioning process, but we do look at every print that we have for a patient. So in a way that kind of is ongoing quality assurance. We do that density check. We verify that the scaling and uniformity, Hounsfield units, all that kind of stuff is good right before treatment. So in a way, yes, that is ongoing, but we haven't had to do any of the commissioning process over.
Great. So next question is, did you use an RED or relative electron density value that was specific for electrons, or was the RED value for photons sufficient for both modalities?
Yeah, so we use the same value, but we are more concerned with the physical density because we're using Actiros and Electron Monte Carlo, and they kind of use the physical tables inside of Eclipse. So that 1.2 value, which I spoke about, we did test on photons and electrons, and we found that it worked very well. Our results and pass rates were very good. So they are the same, and we haven't had to change them.
I'm glad to hear that. That's good. Next question is, do the therapists at time of treatment, do the therapists in the room have any advice or tolerances for the 3D printed bolus in terms of placement and or the cone beam CT?
Yeah, so I think experience definitely helps with that. Some of the first bolus that they looked at, it was all foreign. They didn't know how to put it on the patient, anything like that. But we try and typically give them those kind of, points at like the nose, the bridge of the nose, where it really aids in setup. So they've been trained to, kind of find those anchor points, place it on there. They kind of look around the corners of the bolus to verify that there's no large gap underneath. But, just putting it on the patient and doing a little wiggling almost can actually kind of find that minimum, distance between the bolus and the skin. So I think, other than that, we usually do one strip of tape, maybe, that goes across the whole bolus. We typically don't put the bolus in the mask just because it tends to be more uncomfortable for the patient. But, I think just, verifying that the bolus is not moving, verifying that there's no big gaps, and making sure it's secure.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Next question is on the about printing. So who does the printing on your team? And I guess this next part probably depends, but how much time does it take to set up and run the printer?
So initially it was pretty much all me doing the printing. As we, needed more boluses made, we kind of expanded it. So the treatment planning process can be largely dosimetrist. Some of the more complicated cases our physicists will take. But as far as the printing process and creation of 3D bolus, it has been mostly physics. There are dosimetrists that are comfortable with, starting up the printer, warming it up, and, just, printing a file. But I would say it largely does rely on physics. And as far as time, it's gotten pretty smooth. Once we have a finished plan, we can probably get it ready for printing in 10 or so minutes, warm up this printer. So I don't know, from time to approved plan to printing is probably 20 minutes now. Then the printing process is, the physical machine taking time to make the print is probably the longest. So we usually like to leave it go overnight and have some time in between the actual treatment.
That's great.
Yeah, mostly physics.
I remember some boluses that our therapists would have to make that could take hours to fabricate for specific patients. So 10, 20 minutes, that's fantastic.
So I think we have time for one more question. Ellis, I think you have a question that has come in.
You see here, okay. What is the physicist's role at the time of treatment planning? Is the physicist consulted by the dosimetrist for the placement of the bolus or positioning?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the complexity of the case. So for something like a chest wall bolus, our dosimetrists are, more than adequate at, placing a bolus and, doing a plan. And, they're better than me at breast, planning anyway. So for those type of things, they can pretty much take it all over. When it kind of gets into those IMRT plans or modulated electron bolus, definitely physics is involved, if not planning it. It helps to understand, the effects of creating different depths of the bolus and how it affects dose and those kind of things. So I think the complexity is what determines who's going to be planning. But, it can be kind of fun to plan some of these because it is so unique and it really does help the patient. So it's a good solution, and it's not something that, I don't like doing. It's a rewarding process.
Great to hear. We love to hear satisfied customers say that. Well, that concludes the question and answer portion of the presentation today. Again, I'd like to thank you, Derek, for taking the time to kind of walk everyone through your experience and Lehigh Valley's experience, with the implementation and clinical application of Adaptiiv software. And I should have mentioned that Ellis is our product manager for the EBRT side. So anything that has to do with our simple bolus or our modulated electron bolus solutions, Ellis manages that. So thanks to you, Ellis, for taking the time as well today and working with Derek alongside as he's gone through this process.
Thanks so much, Derek, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.